Berlin, May 1945. The city was nothing but fire, rubble, and smoke. Soviet soldiers advanced through the ruins, rifles in hand, faces hardened by 4 years of unimaginable loss. For them, this was not only the final conquest of the war, it was personal. Every block of Berlin reminded them of burned villages, murdered families, and mass graves on their own soil. And among the thousands of German prisoners who raised their hands in surrender, there was one group that would find no mercy: the Waffen-SS. To the Soviets, these men were not soldiers. They were executioners, the enforcers of terror across Eastern Europe. Entire towns had been wiped out under their boots, partisans hanged in public squares, women and children massacred. In Soviet eyes, a captured SS man was not a prisoner of war protected by any convention. He was a criminal, and his uniform, his insignia, even a small tattoo on his arm, was enough proof. The SS knew this. Many tried desperately to hide their identities in the final days of the war. They burned their uniforms, scratched out blood-type tattoos with knives, and tried to blend into the ranks of the regular Wehrmacht. Some even rubbed ash into their skin to cover the marks that betrayed them. But when the Red Army combed through the ruins, civilians guided them. Survivors who had endured years of occupation pointed fingers. That man. He was there when they shot my father. One accusation was often enough. Testimonies decades later still echo the fear of those moments. Heinrich Schultz, a captured SS member near Berlin, remembered the exact second his tattoo was noticed. When they saw it, he said, "I stopped being a soldier. I became a war criminal." The Soviets began separating prisoners almost immediately. One line for regular troops, another for anyone suspected of SS ties. This division was no bureaucratic detail. It was a death sentence waiting to be handed down. Interrogations were short, brutal, and often meaningless. Names were shouted, questions fired. And sometimes, before the ink on a report had dried, shots rang out. Summary executions became part of the landscape. In villages across Eastern Europe, retribution was even swifter. Soviet commanders sometimes brought captured SS men into the public square, standing them before the very civilians who had survived their occupation. The survivors didn't need paperwork. They needed only their memories. Old women, children, entire families pointed to the men who had burned their homes or led them at gunpoint. The verdict was decided in seconds. A shot to the head, a body left in the mud. No court, no defense. Just revenge, raw and unfiltered. But executions were only part of the story. Others were spared, if that word can even be used, and sent eastward, deeper into Soviet territory. For these men, survival meant the gulags, vast networks of forced labor camps stretching across Siberia and Kazakhstan. Few would ever return. Hunger, frostbite, and endless work became their reality. In Berlin itself, chaos blurred every line. Entire groups of prisoners were lined up against walls, forced to dig their own graves or marched away into the night, never to be seen again. Soviet officers kept detailed lists, but they also listened to the shouts of the civilians around them. That one laughed when they killed my brother. That one took food from our starving children. In this storm of grief and fury, evidence and emotion blended into one. It wasn't just soldiers who sealed their own fates. Small marks betrayed them. An SS ring left hidden in a boot, a scrap of insignia sewn into a collar. Even their posture, too rigid, too proud, could give them away. And once identified, there was no escape. Those who survived the first days of captivity would learn a terrible truth. Raising your hands in surrender did not guarantee life. For the SS, surrender often meant only a slower death. Some were marched east in endless columns, boots worn down to rags, beaten if they stumbled, shot if they tried to fall behind. Others were forced to carry out humiliating tasks, cleaning rubble, dragging corpses, or digging latrines under the gaze of the people they had once oppressed. The fall of the Third Reich marked the end of the war for most of the world. Celebrations erupted across Europe and America. But for SS prisoners, it was not the end. It was the beginning of something far darker, a reckoning that would not stop at justice, but descend into vengeance. In the ruins of Berlin and across the vast Soviet front, one thing became brutally clear. The war for these men did not end when they laid down their arms. It was only just beginning. Imagine being branded with a single mark on your arm, a small tattoo that decides whether you live or die. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, if you carried such a mark, would you try to cut it out, or would you risk being recognized? And while you're here, hit like and subscribe, because the story you're about to hear is one that most people have never been told, and it deserves to be remembered. The first days after Germany's surrender were not just chaotic. They were a storm of fury, grief, and vengeance. Across Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and the eastern regions of Germany, Soviet troops gathered prisoners into improvised camps. The process of sorting them began immediately. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers went into one line. The suspected SS went into another. The difference between those two lines was life or death. Civilians played a crucial role. Villagers who had endured years of terror were called into the camps. Men, women, even children were asked to walk among the prisoners and point out their oppressors. Imagine the weight of that moment. Standing face to face with the men who had burned your village, who had shot your family, and being told, which one was it? Every finger raised, every name shouted, sealed another fate. In some camps, these identifications were followed by immediate execution. A testimony from Belarus tells of 30 SS men being lined up before a crowd of villagers. There was no trial, no written verdict, only the sound of rifles and then silence. The survivors of Nazi brutality had witnessed justice, or vengeance, depending on who you ask. For Soviet officers, this process was both practical and symbolic. On one hand, they wanted to punish those responsible for atrocities. On the other, they wanted to send a message. The Red Army had lost more than 26 million citizens in the war. Entire towns had been erased, entire families slaughtered. To show mercy to the SS would have been unthinkable. A letter preserved in the Moscow archives, written by a Soviet officer in 1945, captures the mindset. How can we forgive those who murdered our families, who left our land in ashes? These men do not deserve a trial. They deserve to die as they made ours die. Still, not every SS prisoner was executed immediately. Many were transferred to transit camps, where interrogations dragged on for hours. NKVD agents, the feared Soviet secret police, sought not only confessions, but also information. They wanted to identify officers, camp guards, and those tied directly to massacres. Prisoners were beaten, deprived of sleep, and forced to confess crimes, whether they had committed them or not. In some regions, entire communities were invited to witness public punishments. In Belarus and Poland, captured SS men were paraded through the streets before being hanged or shot. For the survivors of Nazi rule, it was cathartic. For the prisoners, it was annihilation without defense. Soviet propaganda documented these events with photographs and films, presenting them as righteous justice. Posters and newspapers spread the message: the SS will not escape punishment. But not all punishments were swift. Some SS prisoners were deliberately spared, not for mercy, but for utility. They were sent east, deeper into Soviet territory. toward the gulags. There, vengeance would take another form. Slow, grinding, and merciless. Between executions, public trials, and endless interrogations, one truth remained. For the SS, surrendering did not mean survival. It meant facing a reckoning shaped as much by rage as by justice. In the words of one Soviet officer who oversaw a camp in Ukraine, "A rifle shot is quick, but hunger, cold, and labor, that is the punishment they deserve." The nightmare for these men was far from over. The real ordeal was only beginning, in the frozen wastes of Siberia, where the gulags waited like silent graves. For those SS soldiers who were not executed in the streets or condemned in village squares, another fate awaited, one far slower and more merciless. They were packed into freight trains, sealed inside with little air, no water, and almost no food, and transported east. Days turned into weeks. The destination, the gulags of the Soviet Union. The gulag system stretched across the most remote corners of the USSR. Siberia, Kazakhstan, the Arctic North. For ordinary prisoners, life there was already brutal. For captured SS men, it was worse. They were classified as maximum security enemies, branded not as soldiers, but as ideological criminals. That classification meant one thing: the harshest treatment possible. On arrival, they were stripped, searched, and registered. The process was mechanical, indifferent. Blood-type tattoos were checked. Scars, records, and old documents sealed their identity. Once labeled SS, they were sent to the hardest camps, often located in regions where winter temperatures dropped to 40 degrees C. The barracks were little more than wooden shacks. Walls were thin, roofs leaked, and overcrowding meant dozens of men sleeping on rough planks, wrapped in torn blankets, pressed against each other for warmth. At night, the cold crept in like a second executioner. Many never woke up. Food was another weapon. Daily rations consisted of a slice of black bread and a bowl of watery cabbage soup. Sometimes, a scrap of dried fish. It was never enough. A man forced to work 14 hours in sub-zero temperatures needed thousands of calories. Instead, he received barely enough to stay alive. Hunger gnawed constantly. Prisoners fought over crumbs, gnawed on belts, or chewed bark just to trick their stomachs into silence. Disease spread like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis thrived in the freezing, filthy conditions. Without medical care, a cough could turn into a death sentence. The sick were often separated into so-called waiting barracks. Everyone knew what that meant. You went in, but you did not come out. Work was relentless. Prisoners cut timber in endless forests, mined coal in collapsing shafts, or built roads across frozen wastelands. At dawn, guards herded them into columns, rifles at their backs. The day ended only when exhaustion left men collapsing in the snow. Those who fell behind were beaten, sometimes shot, sometimes left to freeze where they dropped. A former SS prisoner, Wilhelm Köpper, later recalled his time in Siberia. The cold was unbearable. The food was nothing. The work never ended. If you collapsed, they let you die in the snow. His testimony was one among thousands. Death became routine. In some camps, corpses were collected daily in wheelbarrows and dumped into mass graves, covered with lime. One prisoner remembered being assigned to burial duty. We carried dozens of bodies every day. After a month, we stopped counting. It was as if death itself was part of our labor. Escape seemed impossible. The gulags were surrounded not only by fences and guards, but by the vast, merciless landscape. Forests stretched endlessly. Temperatures killed within hours. Wolves hunted in packs. Some men tried anyway. They slipped out under cover of night, desperate for freedom. Few got more than a few kilometers before being caught, frozen, or torn apart by animals. Their bodies were dragged back to camp, displayed as warnings. Others were executed publicly, their deaths staged as lessons for the rest. And yet, amid this frozen hell, some spark of humanity survived. Prisoners formed tiny networks of solidarity. A crust of bread was shared, a ragged glove passed along, a few whispered words of encouragement offered in the dark. These gestures were fragile, easily crushed by hunger or betrayal, but they made the difference between despair and endurance. A Soviet guard once wrote with frustration, "Even in the worst conditions, these men found ways to stay united. They did not surrender easily." The gulags were designed not only to break bodies, but to destroy spirits. Beatings were common. Solitary confinement in unheated cells was used as punishment. Prisoners were forced to sign confessions, often admitting to crimes they had never committed. Paranoia ran deep, with spies planted among the inmates. Trust was dangerous. Betrayal could mean death. Still, resistance flickered. Prisoners carved secret messages into wood, hid scraps of letters, or simply refused to let go of their identity. Survival itself became an act of defiance. For the SS men who ended up in the gulags, life was reduced to a simple equation: endure hunger, endure cold, endure pain. Day after day, year after year, until the body or mind finally gave way. The war had ended in 1945. But for them, the nightmare had only just begun. Not every SS prisoner in the gulags chose silent endurance. For some, survival meant another path, one of collaboration, propaganda, and betrayal. The Soviets understood the power of hunger and fear. They dangled just enough hope to break men who might otherwise have resisted. And for a few, the temptation proved irresistible. Collaboration took many forms. Some prisoners, especially those who spoke Russian or had technical skills, were offered slightly better conditions in exchange for service. Translators were needed to interpret orders. Carpenters, engineers, and doctors were valuable in camps where death was constant. A man who fixed a generator or treated sick prisoners could earn an extra ration of bread, maybe a coat. Maybe one more winter of life. But the price was steep. Other prisoners saw collaborators as traitors, men who bought survival with betrayal. The most controversial role was that of informant. NKVD officers recruited prisoners to spy on their comrades, report escape attempts, and denounce those suspected of anti-Soviet talk. Some agreed out of desperation, others under direct threat. The discovery of an informant often ended in brutal revenge. Survivors later described informers being beaten to death by fellow inmates, their bodies hidden until morning roll call. Propaganda was another weapon. The Soviets forced prisoners to attend mandatory political education sessions. They watched films of Nazi atrocities, read communist texts, and listened to lectures on Marxism-Leninism. Younger prisoners, especially, were pressured to confess the errors of fascism and embrace socialism. Some resisted silently. Others repeated the slogans out loud, not from conviction, but from necessity. A few went further. Prisoners were filmed denouncing the Nazi regime, praising the Soviet Union, and declaring themselves reformed. These recordings were used both inside camps and abroad as propaganda. One German prisoner, visibly emaciated and trembling, declared before the camera, "Thanks to the Soviet Union, I now see the truth. Fascism is death. Socialism is life." Was he convinced? Or simply starving and afraid? History cannot answer. One of the most infamous cases was Karl Duba, a former SS officer captured in East Prussia. Fluent in Russian, he offered his services as a translator. Soviet records show that he negotiated better food and slightly safer work for some prisoners in exchange for information about others. Escape plans, black market exchanges, whispered defiance. To his comrades, he was a traitor. To the Soviets, he was a tool. And when his usefulness ran out, he was sent back into the general barracks like everyone else. Collaboration did not always mean survival after release. In West Germany, former SS men who had worked with the Soviets were branded traitors. Some were assaulted by neighbors, rejected by their families, or forced into exile. Even in East Germany, where the communist regime tried to reintegrate some collaborators, they lived under constant suspicion, interrogated regularly by the Stasi. Their survival carried a permanent stigma. The Soviets also experimented with re-education. In certain camps, small committees of German prisoners were formed to study socialist literature, debate the failures of fascism, and write letters of repentance. Some of these letters were published in newspapers as proof that communism could redeem even the enemies of humanity. Yet most of these gestures were hollow, driven by fear and the desire for one more ration of food. The moral line blurred completely. Was a man a traitor if he collaborated to keep himself alive? Did sharing a propaganda slogan mean betrayal or just survival? In the gulags, the answers were never clear. Hunger twisted everything. A Soviet officer once admitted in a report, "They do not collaborate out of conviction, but because they have no choice. When they stop being useful, they are returned to the others." Some prisoners clung to dignity, refusing every offer, enduring starvation rather than bend. Others compromised, hoping to see another sunrise. Both paths carried their own punishment. In the end, collaboration was not a guarantee of freedom. It was often just a slower death, wrapped in shame. For those who endured without breaking, and for those who survived by bending, another fate still awaited. By the mid-1950s, the world outside had changed. Stalin was dead, and the gates of the gulags began to creak open. But freedom would not mean peace. When Joseph Stalin died in 1953, the iron grip of the gulag system began to loosen. Across the Soviet Union, reforms trickled through the camps. Executions slowed, rations improved slightly, and talk of release spread among the prisoners like a fragile flame. For the surviving SS men, this was the first flicker of hope in nearly a decade. But freedom did not come quickly. Negotiations between Moscow and West Germany, led by Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, dragged on. Only in 1955 did the large-scale repatriations begin. By then, the men who stumbled out of Siberian forests and Kazakh deserts were ghosts of themselves. Gaunt, sick, crippled by frostbite, their bodies marked by years of forced labor. The journeys home were grueling. Packed again into crowded trains, many prisoners died before they even crossed into Eastern Europe. One survivor, Heinrich K., remembered, "We were shadows. Some died on the way. It was not a return home. It was just another stage of survival." Arrival did not bring joy. The Germany they had left no longer existed. Cities were rebuilt, borders redrawn, and society divided into East and West. Families had moved on or been destroyed. And the stigma of the SS followed them like a curse. In East Germany, under Soviet control, some returnees were monitored, interrogated, even recruited into low-level administrative work. A few were held up as propaganda examples of men who had been redeemed by socialist re-education. But the surveillance never stopped. Their past was never forgotten. In West Germany, the reception was colder still. While Wehrmacht veterans were often received back into communities, former SS men were treated as pariahs. Neighbors rejected them. Families shunned them. Some survivors changed their names and moved far away, trying to bury their past. Others lived in silence, never speaking of what had happened in the camps. A Bavarian report from 1958 recorded cases of returnees being physically attacked once their history was revealed. Even among themselves, the survivors carried scars that words could not heal. Some were tormented by guilt, remembering atrocities they had committed or witnessed during the war. Others clung to bitterness, refusing to see themselves as anything but victims of Soviet vengeance. Many were broken beyond repair, crippled by disease, haunted by nightmares, unable to rejoin civilian life. For those who had collaborated in the gulags, survival carried a double punishment. In camp, they were despised by fellow prisoners. Back home, they were branded traitors. One former SS man who had worked as a translator for the Soviets was beaten by his neighbors on the day he returned. His privileges in the camp had bought him only a lifetime of shame. The moral questions left behind are impossible to answer neatly. Were these men punished for their crimes or destroyed in the name of vengeance? Did every SS man deserve the same fate, regardless of rank or role? And did the brutality of Soviet justice cross the line into repeating the very cruelty it sought to condemn? The Soviet Union defended its treatment of SS prisoners as historical justice, a way to honor the millions of civilians slaughtered by Nazi occupation. And yet, the methods, summary executions, torture, starvation, forced labor until death, leave a troubling legacy. Justice blurred into vengeance. Punishment blurred into cruelty. One German survivor, Karl Miller, wrote years after his release, "Returning home did not mean returning to life. The war had taken everything, and the gulag finished destroying what was left. Many of us never found our place in this new world." The story of the SS prisoners does not offer a simple lesson. It is not about absolution, nor is it only about condemnation. It is about the extremes of human suffering when revenge becomes the law, and when history itself demands blood as payment. For many SS men, surrendering in 1945 did not mean the end of war. It meant the beginning of another, one fought in the cold, in hunger, and in silence. And though decades have passed, their fate still forces us to confront an unsettling question. Where does justice end, and where does vengeance begin?